My friends, the Russian army is back on the offensive, and they might be close to scoring a decisive victory with all the ground they captured in the last 10 days.
No, God!
Here from France 24, Ukrainians brace for new Russian assault on Avdiivka. The New York Times, Russia presses ahead with offensive push in eastern Ukraine. The goal is to capture the city of Avdiivka, located on the northern outskirts of Donetsk. But calling this place a city would not do it justice. This Ukrainian stronghold is so well fortified that we should call it a fortress or a citadel. Anyway, on the first day of this offensive, the Russian armored columns got clapped hard. However, despite this tactical setback, we can be sure that the Russians will keep going no matter what. It's just a matter of time before the Ukrainian army abandons Avdiivka. The map doesn't lie. The situation is critical. Ukrainian troops are caught in a 30-kilometer long cauldron. The Russians are pressing both in the north and in the south, and there are only 8 kilometers until the two tips touch. No. Now, under the threat of encirclement of Avdiivka, Ukraine is transferring all available reserves to Donetsk.
And it's gone.
Rings a bell. We can salute the creativity of the Russian HQ. They opened the drawers and essentially came up with Bakhmut 2.0. And we can be sure that the overall objective of the Russian army is to drain as many Ukrainian battalions into Avdiivka to create another meat grinder, the Avdiivskaya Мясорубка, and to increase the world's attention to this sector. Putin went there to visit the troops. Very similar PR stunts that Wagner pulled in Bakhmut. Russia picked the perfect target. Avdiivka is right next to Donetsk, a major logistics hub for the entire region. And the large urban area can also house and camouflage a massive number of Russian troops. On top of that, Avdiivka has become some sort of symbol of resistance for Ukraine. It's the last Ukrainian position on the outskirts of Donetsk, the rebel capital of the separatists, and it has been continuously fortified since 2014. And thus, for the morale of the nation, this place has become of utmost importance. I counted roughly 21 Ukrainian battalions for the Avdiivka tactical group, roughly 15,000 troops including the elite 1st Special Purpose Brigade, which is believed to have an entire battalion of foreign volunteers. With all the reinforcements that are poured into this cauldron, we're talking about roughly 20,000 Ukrainian soldiers. On the other side, according to reports of the ISW, the Russians positioned 15 regiments around Avdiivka, so roughly 45,000 men. Reason number 2 is that a Russian victory would decrease their front line by 20 kilometers. And with all the reserves that would get released from frontline duties, they could exploit this breach they just created in Ukraine's defensive belt along Donetsk Oblast. And it would allow the Russian army to go for a strike on Pokrovsk or Konstantinivka. Welcome to History Legends, and here are the latest news of the Russo-Ukrainian war. If you're new to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. As you know, some of my videos have been targeted with limited or no ads. So make sure to check out my Patreon or PayPal to keep the show running. Thank you to everyone that has already helped, and welcome to the headquarters. Long story short, the Russian army has been trying to get Avdiivka since February 2022. But it's really in March of this year that they started shaping operations with the capture of Krasnohorivka. And then the Russians stood still for 7 months since they were dealing with Ukraine's summer offensive. And the moment the Ukrainian offensive stopped, around the 2nd of October, the first reports emerged of increased Russian activity in the sector of Avdiivka, such as more infiltrations, and a growing number of artillery strikes on Ukrainian positions. The next day, major airstrikes were reported against the coke plant north of the city. Did somebody say coke? We have to defend this coke plant at all costs. People on the ground also reported that this area was being razed to the ground, as Russian aircraft dropped multiple 1.5 ton bombs on this factory. And you can see the results of one of such FAB 1500. All hell broke loose on October 10th at 6 a.m. 200 howitzers and MRLS systems fired towards Avdiivka. For 5 hours, non-stop Russian artillery and airstrikes north of the city, quickly followed by ground operations. Of course, you'll tell me that by bombarding the sector, it will alert the Ukrainians about the intentions of the Russian army. Correct. But this preparatory bombardment literally demolished the enemy's first line of defense. And to avoid the Ukrainians bringing reinforcements and ammunition to the contact line, the Russians also targeted the Oreshtino railway station. During this push forward, Russian aviation also heavily bombarded Stepove, which was effectively a very strategic settlement to capture. From their base in Krasnoorivka, the Russians attacked in two axes. The Russians would have to take control or bypass this 200-meter high waste heap, surrounded by two lakes, which could easily turn these pathways into choke points. So to bypass all this, the Russians decided to order their armored columns to rush forward at full speed. You had a huge armored column moving towards Ukrainian lines. I counted roughly 20 BMPs and tanks. This column was geolocated right here on the map, meaning the objective was clear. Bypass the waste heap, reach the railway line, and attempt to gain a foothold in a coke plant, or even push towards Stepove. Meanwhile, a little bit in the north, their objective was to cross the open fields, get over the rail embankment in this wide flanking maneuver, and capture the villages of Stepove and Berdishi. In my opinion, in this offensive, the Russian army tried something new. We already know that they had Storm Z assault squads a la Wagnera due to the firepower and mobility limitations of infantry squads and the time constraint to reach the objectives. I think the Russian command just gave these guys armored vehicles and created Storm Z mechanized groups, literally SMG. The concept would be very similar to World War II Soviet shock units, with their infamous tank descent units that would storm enemy positions aboard tanks with SMGs. Oh my god, it all makes sense now. Now, the sad reality is that these shock units would often be sacrificed in order to open a breach, as they often suffered nearly 100% casualties. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, because the first reports were optimistic, as rumors grew that the Russians had indeed achieved some sort of breakthrough. The enemy is not offering fierce resistance. And here the commander of one of the units of the 10th Tank Regiment claimed everything is going according to plan. In this very unique video, you witness the Russian armored assault in first-person shooter mode. These two tanks of the 114th Brigade roamed around like pirates, firing at any possible enemy hideout to cover the flanks of the main column. Eventually they reached the main body of the attack force, and here's an almost cinematic shot of 5 Russian tanks in action before we see the 2 tanks pass by various armored vehicles. Yeah, that was before they got wrecked. But there was also this video of an entire Ukrainian squad, at least 12 men, simply running away from their trenches. And some of these units of riflemen were shelled the moment they left their trenches and got exposed in open ground. You can imagine the resulting effect. In this video, you can see Russian soldiers inspecting a Ukrainian trench they just captured. We can see that these trenches were turned into concrete fortresses, with many bunkers linked up by underground tunnels. And apparently the entire perimeter was covered with CCTV cameras and motion sensors. Some of the Russian recon units managed to push 3 kilometers deep inside enemy lines and started occupying the village of Berdishi. Here you can see some of these Russian infantrymen pushing through the village. That was a very critical moment for the Ukrainian army. The loss of Berdishi would mean that the only supply line of the Avdiivka garrison would be through Orlivka. On Telegram, there were also these reports that the attack was going too well, that it was too easy, and that the Ukrainians actually lured Russian forces into a massive firebag. Yet, how could this happen? In preparation of this offensive, Russian artillery fired at the most likely positions where Ukrainian howitzers could be deployed at. Like here when they spotted a Polish-made Krab self-propelled howitzer deployed 9 kilometers away from the front. And during the first hours of this Russian artillery barrage, Ukrainian artillery remained silent. And this pushed the Russians into some false sense of confidence. The Russians then released the armored columns, and this is when the Ukrainian artillerymen removed their cover and unleashed an extremely precise storm of steel. A day or two after the attack, we got the full extent of Russian losses, like these pictures that show 5 destroyed armored vehicles. As you can see on this map, the Russian attack towards the coke plant had failed miserably. The main column lost 20 armored vehicles on this road alone. That's essentially all the vehicles of the column I showed you at the beginning. Here are some screenshots of the resulting Ukrainian artillery strikes. We could see some small infantry units trying to push forward despite the losses in armored vehicles, but even they got hammered. For example, at another location you had 1 Russian tank and 1 BMP destroyed, plus 18 Russian soldiers around this location, KIA, most likely targeted by cluster munitions. And in this one we can see a unit of 7 Russian vehicles that got targeted, composed of 3 MRAPs, 1 BMP and 3 tanks. I could only see 1 tank that was still functional, and that seemed to be covering some infantry or crew members hiding in the bushes. But otherwise, all the other vehicles were not moving. As you can see, the toll was quite heavy. Just with these little snippets, we have at least 28 Russian tanks, BMPs or MRAPs left behind. In this footage, a Russian T-80 BVM got destroyed, and because of heavy enemy fire, the neighboring BTR-80 simply abandoned the tank crew behind, which was then at the mercy of Ukrainian shells. As you know, from a military perspective, losing tank crews is much worse, it's 10 times worse than losing the vehicle itself, which can easily be replaced. In the end, how many losses are we talking about? In regards to Ukrainian losses, so now onto Russian losses. OSINT Technical believes that on October 10th and on the 11th, Russia had lost a total of 15 tanks and 33 infantry fighting vehicles, for a total of 48. Now, according to various Ukrainian sources, they geolocated 70 destroyed vehicles, 15 of which were Ukrainian, allegedly. Now, Telegram channel Deep State UA outbid the previous claims and said that during the attack, the Russian military lost no less than 63 units of military equipment. And then the Kyiv Post outbid them again and claimed that the figure had risen to 102 tanks and 183 armored vehicles lost, with 2,840 Russian troops KIA. Now on day 2 of this offensive, on the 11th of October, we noticed a dramatic change of pace of this offensive north of Avdiivka, especially considering that Ukraine sent a couple battalions of the 31st Mechanized Brigade to counterattack the tired Russian forces that could not be resupplied and get reinforcements. And whenever Russian armored vehicles spread out and abandoned the main roads, they entered minefields and got swarmed by FPV drones. It's literally the same thing as the Ukrainian summer offensive. Same thing for the Russian reinforcements trying to reach the line of contact. Like this tank that was transporting an entire squad that got a huge load in its face from a mine, and then everybody just ran away.
Why are you running? Why are you running?
There are also many videos of such fleeing groups of Russian soldiers being targeted by a combination of auto grenade launchers, mortars, and, like we said before, cluster munitions. According to the reports of the battle, the Russian army managed to push north of Krasnoarivka and fought hard to maintain their outposts near Berdichi and Stepove, but with the incoming Ukrainians on their right flank and the enemy units still in their back across the rail embankment, it became mission impossible. The Russians tried as much as possible to press the ruler, but what was thought to be a 5-kilometer breakthrough ended up being 2.5 kilometers at most. And if we look at a 3D map, we can see that there's not a hill but a slight elevation of terrain that overlooks these two settlements. And we can believe that the Ukrainians had fortified bastions there, with many machine guns, auto-grenade launchers, mortars harassing advancing Russian units. Same thing for this waste heap, which overlooked the entire battlefield. In the end, Operation North flopped. This is when the Russians started making progress in the south. One Russian unit was spotted here, west of Vodiane, where we see 2 Russian BMPs knocked out, with what seems to be a Russian assault squad walking across the field towards the line of contact. Notice the formation and how spread out they are. That means that if the Ukrainians manage to strike this column, only a couple of guys will get hit and not the entire formation. Another unit was geolocated here, further west, pushing along the village, or rather what is left of it. There are only ruins now. We can see 2 Russian BMPs abandoned, and their infantry component deployed in the rubble while more reinforcements arrived to keep the assault going. Meanwhile, another Russian unit was spotted here, north of Vodiane toward Svierne. Same configuration with BMPs and a 10-man assault squad walking in open terrain. In the end, we can notice some tactical maturity from the Russian side. Instead of sending packed armored columns once again, they ended up using the same small group tactics that the Ukrainians have been using throughout the summer. And that's within 24 hours of the start of the operation. After these 2 days, the battle became somewhat positional. On October 13th, it was reported that the Russians shelled some Ukrainian trenches to the north of Krasnoarivka on their right flank. There was also this video of them using incendiary munitions, whose objective is to burn everything they can in trenches, burn down trees to remove any foliage, and it can even make some ammo depots detonate. And of course, more FABs were dropped on high-rise buildings of Avdiivka. Overall, the Russian command halted ground operations and called for massive artillery support since they were now facing multiple counterattacks by the 80th Airborne Assault and 59th Motorized Infantry Brigades, with Russian units eventually falling back behind the rail embankment. Now, on a tactical level, the Russians are focused on securing the waste heap, whose control would allow them to push all the way towards the rail embankment and even set foot in the coke plant. Now, I don't know who is the commander in the north, but once again, he tried to break through the Ukrainian wall with frontal armored charges. Here, a Russian column passes through the exact same spot where 11 armored vehicles got hammered. They probably use such brute force tactics because they lack demining equipment, have plenty of armored vehicles at the rear in reserve, and they were ordered to advance fast at all costs. In this video alone, they seem to have lost 4 IFVs and 2 tanks. So maybe not so much tactical maturity after all. Anyway, this allowed the Russians to get control of the waste heap and secure the entire eastern side of the rail embankment. A couple of days later, the Russian command activated a new part of the front. By October 16th, the 1487th and 1453rd regiments of the Russian armed forces started pushing straight for the southern outskirts of Avdiivka. Unit seems to have been stopped by a Ukrainian tank hidden in this tree line. Perhaps there were also Ukrainian riflemen positioned on both flanks of this tank. So using this sort of mapping, they called for a drone that detected the exact location of the enemy tank, followed by artillery strikes, and the tank was finished off by a drone dropping a grenade inside the hatch which had been left open by the crew that had fled once the tank got hit. As you can imagine, to maintain the momentum of an offensive, it's very important to be able to bring reinforcements quickly, exactly where needed, and to retrieve the wounded, so that infantry assault squads can push on at full strength without the burden of their injured comrades. The following footage shows this very well. You have an approaching BMP which drops off around 10 Russian riflemen, while the unit that was located there brings 2 or 3 of their wounded to be brought back to the rear. These guys then push forward and mop up the area around the destroyed bridge, which is located right here on the map. And it seems the Ukrainians didn't have much reserves in this sector, because all they could do was to shell these Russian units. They caused X number of casualties, but they could not forbid the enemy force from taking over the terrain. Like that, little by little, the Russians were dismantling one fortified bastion after another. By the 20th of October, they reached the edge of a position called the Tsar's Hunt, which used to be a restaurant. And essentially, it's the last checkpoint before entering Avdiivka proper. This is where we can talk about phase 2 of the offensive. This time, instead of a thunderous assault, Russian units pushed forward at a slower pace with better coordination with each other, all the while securing every position along the way to facilitate the arrival of reinforcements and supplies. If the Russian army can tolerate losses, I mean they've already lost over 100 armored vehicles, if they continue to launch these 2-kilometer leaps inside enemy lines, eventually the northern and southern pincers will link up, and for my American friends, the Russians would then be able to achieve a home run, which would either encircle thousands of Ukrainian soldiers or force them to flee and abandon Avdiivka. Unless Ukrainian assault squads manage to counterattack and erase the previously lost positions. It's just a matter of time before Avdiivka falls. That's all I have for you today. Let me know in the comment section what you thought of my analysis. If you're new to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. And if you want to support my work, you can check out my Patreon or PayPal. The links are in the description below.